Everyone, Dr. Jim back here with another quick reflection for you. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting pretty sick and tired of this whole coronavirus thing. It's all I've been talking about for weeks. When I'm not talking about it, I'm thinking about it. And when I'm not thinking about it, I'm looking at memes about it. We're just all so anxious about this thing right now. And the lesson that's been on my mind has been that the majority of my suffering in this situation consists in anxiety about things I have no control over. When we don't control things, we worry, and when we worry, we ruminate. So let's think for a second just what rumination is. It's when we take a single thought and we just run it through the thought mill again and again and again. We literally just take the exact thought and we just think about it over and over. We can't do anything with it. We can't control anything. We can't take action on it. We just think about it. It's silly, and we spend hours of our lives doing this. But the reality is our brains have a reason for wanting us to do this. We're all control freaks. My kids make fun of me when I want control. They say, "Dad, you just want it how you want it." Well, yeah, that's true. I want it how I want it. I want this virus to go away, but I can't. And so what my brain does is it makes me think about it. And thinking about it gives me just some semblance of control over things. It's totally false. It's your brain is lying to yourself when you do this. But the problem is worrying can be addicting. As miserable as it makes us, it actually tricks us into having a sense of control over what we have no control over. So the solution is to practice what Jean-Pierre de Caussade calls the sacrament of the present moment. So much of our suffering, maybe most of our suffering, comes from dwelling on either the past or the future. God was present in our past and he's preparing us for our futures, but he chooses to meet us right here in the present moment. I was telling someone this last week and he was like, "Yeah, Jim, look, man, the world is falling apart. This moment basically feels like the end of the world. It's the last place I want to ground myself in right now." That's what's happening in the whole world. But I want you to just forget for a moment what's going on in China. Forget what's going on in New York. Forget whatever's going on in your hometown. You can't handle all of it. But what you can handle is what's going on right before you right now. And when you're fully engaged in the present, that's when you're receiving the sacrament of the present moment. Your only possible route to happiness in life comes in responding to whatever is before you right now. It might be trying to have a positive attitude when you're doing virtual school with your kids. If you're at the grocery store, it might mean keeping your social distance while at the same time trying to convey some semblance of neighborliness. If you're serving vulnerable populations in the medical world and one of the shelters, it means that you are providing care to that one soul that's in front of you at that moment. And if you allow yourself to be fully occupied by the present moment, there's no more room for anything else that can cause us distress. The moment should take up our whole being. I want to end with a quick reflection on St. Peter walking on the water, which is an apt passage, I think, for our current situation. In this story, Jesus spends the whole day preaching to the crowds. And in the end, he sends out his disciples in a boat ahead of him so he can take some time to pray by himself. So it's nighttime. Jesus is not with them. And the sea starts to kick up. Mark describes the disciples as rowing in distress, for the waves were against them. What an accurate way of describing our own situation. I feel like we're all rowing in distress and the waves are against us. And since we're fasting from the sacraments right now, we're deprived of that natural grace that comes from communion, which is really is kind of like rowing against the waves somewhat. Then the disciples see him walking across the sea. They think it's a ghost. Now, we've all heard this story so many times, and we get used to it. But imagine what that would be like for those poor disciples. There's literally someone walking across the sea in the middle of the night in a storm, and then the Bible says they were terrified. We can relate to this. Here we are, we're rowing against the waves in the middle of the night, and we don't have Jesus. It's Lent, we haven't had the Eucharist, and I think it's safe to say that the world is collectively terrified. But when Jesus approaches the boat, This is what he says. He says, take heart. It is I. Have no fear. Fear is the enemy of the spiritual life. And when Peter loses his fear, he leaps out of the boat and goes toward Jesus. However, when he notices the waves, when he notices that he's on water, when he gets away from the sacrament of the present moment, he starts to sink. He starts to believe that he needs to be in control of everything. And he has no control. He's in the middle of the sea. But when he takes control out of God's hands and puts it on himself, he's crushed by the weight of that responsibility. There's also another COVID coping skill hidden in this passage. Jesus just spent the whole day preaching to the crowds, being with his disciples. He wanted some space. He didn't want to be cooped up with the disciples in a boat after a day like that. So what does he do? He gets creative, makes some space for himself. Now, Jesus had to walk on water in order to get some space. Hopefully you can find something a little more creative, a little less miraculous to do when you're cooped up with your family 24/7. But it's going to be important for us all to try and get some space. So here we are. We're rowing into stress. Let us keep our mind on Jesus' words, though. He says to the disciples in the middle of the storm, take heart. It is I. Have no fear.